The dispatcher's timestamp was the first detail that exposed the HOA president's story. Elaine Mercer called 911 at exactly 4:12 that Saturday afternoon and reported that intoxicated guests were fighting in my backyard, threatening nearby residents, and possibly carrying a weapon. At that moment, there were no guests in my backyard. My doorbell camera showed a catering van parked beside the curb, while two workers unloaded aluminum trays of barbecue chicken, baked beans, and cornbread. My younger brother was still unfolding tables beneath the maple trees. My wife, Danielle, was inside the kitchen arranging my daughter's graduation cake. The first invited relatives would not arrive for another 20 minutes. Elaine made the call from her black SUV across the street. Through the window, she watched us prepare for a family celebration while describing an emergency that did not exist. She was standing beside my driveway when the first patrol vehicle arrived. Her fitted red blazer was bright against the quiet row of suburban homes. Her jaw was tight. Her eyes were wide with manufactured alarm, and an HOA folder shook in her raised hand as she pointed toward my backyard. Before the officer had fully stepped away from his vehicle, Elaine was demanding that the property be cleared. A second patrol car arrived moments later because the mention of a possible weapon had raised the priority of the call. I understood what that wording could do. I had heard hundreds of dispatch recordings during my career, and I knew that officers approaching a reported armed disturbance had only fragments of information and very little time to judge what was waiting for them. I walked to the edge of the driveway with my hands visible and stopped well before reaching either officer. The patrol sergeant looked at the address on his screen, studied my face, and recognized me as Marcus Reed, the city's police chief. That recognition did not end the call. It made the situation more sensitive. I told the sergeant to follow normal procedure and requested that an outside supervisor oversee the response. I did not access dispatch records, issue orders, or ask anyone to disregard Elaine's accusation. I stepped back beside Danielle, while the officers inspected the yard, spoke with the catering workers, checked the street, and reviewed what could be seen from the property entrance. They found no fight, no intoxicated crowd, no threatening guests, and no weapon. Elaine continued waving her HOA notices as though neighborhood paperwork could transform an empty backyard into a crime scene. But while she argued, the digital record was already preserving the truth. Her 911 call had been logged before the party began, and every camera around my house was counting the minutes against her. I was 52 years old and had spent nearly 3 decades in law enforcement. But at home, I was simply a husband and a father, trying to keep one afternoon peaceful. Danielle and I had bought our house 8 years earlier after saving through most of our marriage. It was not the largest property in the neighborhood, but the backyard was wide enough for family gatherings, a small vegetable garden, and the maple tree our daughter had planted when she started middle school. That Saturday was supposed to celebrate Nia's graduation in civil engineering. She had worked through 4 demanding years, completed an internship with a transportation firm, and become the first person in Danielle's family to earn an engineering degree. The barbecue was not a public event, a fundraiser, or a commercial gathering. It was a private family celebration with cousins, grandparents, church friends, and several neighbors who had watched Nia grow up. Our relationship with the HOA had never been openly hostile before Elaine Mercer became president. We paid our dues on time, maintained the lawn, followed parking rules, and submitted every exterior change for approval. I had no interest in turning ordinary neighborhood disagreements into personal battles. My job already involved enough conflict, and I wanted my home to remain the one place where my title did not matter. Elaine changed that atmosphere slowly. Her first notice concerned Danielle's car remaining in the driveway overnight, while the garage floor was being repaired. A month later, she warned us that our trash bins had stayed visible for 40 minutes beyond the permitted time. Then came a complaint about music during a Sunday cookout, even though the sound had ended before sunset. None of those incidents seemed serious enough to challenge, and each time I responded politely, saved a copy, and moved on. What bothered me was the pattern. Houses on the next block hosted larger gatherings without receiving notices. Delivery trucks stayed parked outside other homes for hours. Several residents left trash containers near their garages well into the following morning. Elaine rarely mentioned them. Danielle noticed it before I was willing to say it aloud. She began keeping the notices in a kitchen drawer because she believed we were being watched more closely than everyone else. I told her we needed evidence before drawing conclusions. Suspicion alone was not enough, especially for someone in my position. I knew how quickly a personal complaint could be portrayed as intimidation when the person making it wore a badge, so I remained careful. I answered every email in writing. I photographed the driveway after gatherings. I saved approval letters, payment confirmations, and copies of the HOA rules. I did not do it because I expected a lawsuit. I did it because experience had taught me that small inconsistencies often became important only after someone denied they had ever happened. The week before Nia's celebration, Elaine sent an email asking how many guests we expected and whether alcohol would be served. The rules required neither disclosure. I replied that it was a private family event and that we would comply with parking and noise restrictions. She sent no response. 2 days later, a security vehicle drove past our home 3 times within an hour. I noticed it, recorded the time, and said nothing. Looking back, that was the moment the barbecue stopped being a simple neighborhood gathering. Elaine had already decided that our family represented a problem. The only thing she had not yet decided was how far she was willing to go to prove it. And before this story moves further, consider whether you have ever been treated differently by an HOA, landlord, or neighborhood board, while others were allowed to ignore the same rules. Those small inconsistencies matter, because sometimes the first warning of a larger abuse is not a dramatic confrontation. It is a pattern everyone else is encouraged to dismiss. The officers remained at our house for less than 20 minutes. They checked the backyard, looked inside the open catering van, spoke with the workers, and confirmed that no disturbance was taking place. By then, only 6 guests had arrived. My mother-in-law was helping Danielle place napkins beside the serving trays, and 2 children were drawing with sidewalk chalk near the porch. There was no music playing, no alcohol on the tables, and nothing that could reasonably be described as threatening. The patrol sergeant documented the scene and explained that the call had not been substantiated. Because I had requested outside supervision, a lieutenant from the neighboring jurisdiction arrived before the officers cleared the address. He reviewed the circumstances, confirmed that normal procedures had been followed, and instructed everyone to preserve their body camera recordings. Elaine stood near the curb throughout the process. Her red blazer remained perfectly buttoned, but the confidence she had displayed when the patrol cars arrived had begun to harden into frustration. She repeatedly opened her HOA folder, removed different notices, and tried to persuade the lieutenant that the party violated neighborhood restrictions. None of the papers supported the emergency she had described to dispatch. When the officers prepared to leave, I thought the confrontation was over. I was wrong. At 7:38 that evening, while my daughter was opening graduation cards, an email from the HOA appeared on my phone. Elaine had issued a $500 emergency violation for hosting an unauthorized commercial event. She claimed that the catering van proved we were operating a paid gathering from a residential property. The HOA rules contained no such definition. Residents used caterers for weddings, anniversaries, and holiday parties every year. The notice also accused us of exceeding an occupancy limit that did not apply to private outdoor gatherings. It described police intervention as evidence that the event had created a threat to public safety, even though the officers had found no violation and had not asked a single guest to leave. I did not respond that night. I took screenshots of the message, downloaded the attachment, and saved the original email with its metadata. Danielle wanted to know whether Elaine could really fine us for something the rules did not prohibit. I told her the amount was less important than the language being used to justify it. Elaine was not merely complaining anymore, she was creating a record. The following morning, every homeowner received a neighborhood safety bulletin. It referred to an unspecified, large, disruptive gathering that had required a multi-unit police response. Although the bulletin did not name our family, it included the date, the block, and enough detail for every resident to know exactly which house it meant. Elaine warned that future events could lead to additional fines, private security intervention, and restrictions on guest access. Several neighbors contacted us privately. Some had watched the police leave without taking action. One woman sent me a photograph taken from her upstairs window. It showed Elaine standing beside her SUV before the first patrol car arrived, holding her phone toward our property. Another neighbor told me that Elaine had called him earlier in the week and asked whether he expected a crowd at our house. By Monday, the situation escalated again. Elaine requested an emergency meeting of the HOA board and proposed a temporary rule requiring our family to submit guest lists 48 hours before any gathering involving more than 10 people. She also wanted advance vehicle information and written approval for outside food vendors. The proposed restriction applied only to our address. One board member objected and asked why the Reed residence was being singled out. Elaine answered that the police response had established a documented security concern. She did not mention that the concern had originated with her own unverified statements. The proposal did not pass that evening, but Elaine acted as though it had. On Tuesday morning, a private security vehicle parked across from our house for nearly 3 hours. The guard photographed 2 cars belonging to relatives who had stayed overnight. Later, the security company sent us a warning stating that HOA management had requested enhanced observation of our property. I called the company's regional office as a homeowner, not as police chief. The manager sounded surprised when I read the warning aloud. He explained that guards could document conditions in common areas, but the company had not approved targeted surveillance of a specific residence. He asked me to forward the notice and said he would investigate who had issued the instruction. That afternoon, Elaine sent another violation. This one claimed our guests had obstructed emergency access during the barbecue. My doorbell footage showed that the street remained open at all times. A fire engine, ambulance, and sanitation truck could have passed without difficulty. The photographs attached to her notice had been taken from angles that made legally parked vehicles appear closer together than they were. I began building a timeline. I listed every notice, every email, every security patrol, and every statement connected to the party. I marked the exact time of Elaine's 911 call, the arrival of each patrol vehicle, the first guest's arrival, and the moment the officers cleared the address. I saved photographs of the street and downloaded footage from every exterior camera before the system could overwrite it. Then a board member named Thomas Avery called me from his personal phone. He spoke carefully and said there were messages I needed to see. Elaine had contacted board members 3 days before the barbecue and described our upcoming gathering as a likely threat to neighborhood security. She had asked the security company to monitor the house before any guests arrived. She had also drafted portions of the emergency violation before making the 911 call. Thomas would not forward the emails yet because he wanted legal advice about his duties as a board member. But he read one sentence to me that changed the direction of the entire dispute. Elaine had written that the board needed to establish a record before the Reed family's gatherings became impossible to control. The record she wanted did not exist, so she had begun constructing one herself. By the end of that week, we had received 3 violation notices, a proposed address-specific restriction, a security warning, and a neighborhood bulletin that distorted the police response. The barbecue was over, but Elaine's campaign was expanding. I still did not accuse her publicly. I did not confront her at the clubhouse or use my position to demand answers. I contacted a civil attorney, placed every document in chronological order, and requested that the evidence be preserved. Because the most dangerous part of Elaine's story was no longer what she had said after police arrived. It was the growing possibility that she had planned the emergency before she ever called 911. My attorney, Rachel Sloan, did not begin with accusations. She began with preservation letters. Within 48 hours, formal notices went to the HOA, the security company, the neighboring police agency, and the vendor that managed the association's email system. The letters required them to preserve dispatch audio, body camera footage, board communications, security logs, violation drafts, photographs, meeting notes, and any deleted messages connected to our address. Rachel explained that the first objective was not to prove motive. It was to prevent the record from changing after people realized how serious the situation had become. I followed the same discipline at home. I copied every video file onto 2 encrypted drives and created a separate folder for still images. Danielle downloaded her messages with Elaine. Nia saved the graduation invitation, guest list, catering contract, and every photograph taken during the celebration. I asked each family member to write down what they remembered, without discussing details with one another first. Their statements were dated and stored, before memories could blend together. The timeline soon became more precise than Elaine's version of events. At 3:46 p.m., the catering van arrived. At 3:51, 2 workers began unloading food. At 4:03, my brother carried folding chairs into the yard. At 4:12, Elaine called 911 and described intoxicated guests, aggressive behavior, and a possible weapon. At 4:18, the first invited guest pulled into our driveway. At 4:26, the first patrol vehicle arrived. The sequence left almost no room for confusion. Elaine had reported conduct before the people accused of that conduct were even present. Rachel requested the 911 recording through the proper legal process. Because I was the police chief, I refused access through departmental channels and signed a written conflict disclosure. The request was handled by outside counsel and reviewed by the neighboring agency supervising the response. That separation slowed the process, but it also protected the evidence from any claim that I had influenced it. When the recording arrived, Elaine's voice was controlled at first. She identified herself as HOA president and said a large group had gathered at a residence under prior observation. Then her claims became more specific. She said people were shouting in the street, that teenagers appeared intoxicated, and that one adult had displayed something that might be a firearm. The cameras showed an empty sidewalk, unopened beverage coolers, and catering workers carrying aluminum trays. Rachel replayed the call several times and marked every statement that could be tested against independent evidence. She did not label the call criminal or discriminatory. She called it materially inconsistent with the documented scene. That language was deliberate. It allowed the facts to lead the investigation without overstating what had not yet been proven. The private security company produced its patrol log next. Elaine had contacted a local supervisor 4 days before the party and requested heightened monitoring of our property. The supervisor had entered the request into the system without approval from regional management. The notes described our family gathering as a possible unauthorized event, even though Elaine had no guest count and no evidence of a rule violation. More troubling was the timestamp on the first draft of the $500 penalty. The file had been created at 2:37 p.m. on the day of the barbecue, more than an hour before the catering van arrived, and nearly 5 hours before the notice was sent. The draft already referred to police intervention. Thomas Avery eventually met Rachel at her office. He brought printed board emails and a copy of the HOA's governing documents. He was nervous, but he said he had joined the board to review landscaping contracts, not to help one person build a case against a family. The emails showed that Elaine had asked board members to approve enhanced restrictions on our address before the party. No vote had occurred. 2 members had objected. One had asked whether other large gatherings would face the same rules. Elaine replied that our situation required special handling because the Reed household presented a developing security risk. She had never explained what that risk was. The governing documents created another problem for her. The president could send routine notices, but fines above $100 required board review and an opportunity for the homeowner to be heard. Address-specific guest restrictions required a formal amendment and could not be imposed through an emergency email. Elaine had bypassed both procedures. Rachel then compared enforcement records from the previous 18 months. There had been 7 neighborhood gatherings with caterers, 5 with more guests than ours, and 3 that produced verified noise complaints after quiet hours. None resulted in a 911 call from HOA leadership. None produced targeted security monitoring. None led to proposed guest lists or address-specific restrictions. Our barbecue had generated the strongest response before it had generated any disturbance at all. The neighboring police agency completed its administrative review first. The officers had acted appropriately based on the information dispatch received. Their body cameras showed a calm property, cooperative residents, and Elaine repeatedly demanding enforcement of HOA rules that police had no authority to impose. The review cleared the responding officers, but it preserved the question that mattered most. Why had dispatch received such specific claims about events that had not happened? By then, Elaine had stopped sending notices. She did not apologize or withdraw the fines. She simply became quiet. That silence did not reassure me. It meant she finally understood that the dispute was no longer controlled by the story she told first. It was controlled by timestamps, preserved files, independent witnesses, and written authority. Rachel assembled the evidence into 4 sections: the false emergency narrative, the pre-planned HOA enforcement, the unequal treatment of comparable households, and the procedural violations committed after the police left. Then she prepared a demand for the HOA's insurer and outside counsel. Before sending it, she placed one document at the top of the file. It was not the 911 recording. It was Elaine's penalty draft, created hours before the police response she later used to justify it. Rachel's demand letter did not accuse Elaine of a crime. It did something more damaging. It placed the documents in an order that made her explanations collapse one by one. The letter began with the penalty draft created at 2:37 p.m. It already stated that police intervention had confirmed a dangerous gathering, even though no guests had arrived and no officer had been dispatched. The next exhibit was Elaine's 4:12 p.m. 911 call, followed by camera footage showing an almost empty property. Then came the 4:26 p.m. body camera recordings, which documented a quiet backyard and officers finding no violation. The sequence showed that the official story had not developed from events at the party. The story had existed before the events it supposedly described. The HOA's outside attorney responded within 3 days. He requested an emergency pause on all enforcement against our address and advised the board not to delete, edit, or discuss any related records outside counsel. The association's insurance carrier appointed its own investigator after learning that Elaine had imposed a $500 fine without a board vote and had asked a security contractor to monitor one household without authorization. The investigator found one more detail Rachel had not expected. Elaine had used her personal HOA administrator password to alter the incident description after officers left. The original entry described an anticipated large gathering. The revised version described a confirmed public safety disturbance. The system retained both versions and the precise time of the change. That audit log closed the last gap. Elaine could no longer argue that she had merely repeated what police told her. The police had told her no disturbance existed. She had changed the HOA record afterward to suggest the opposite. Rachel still avoided claiming that race was the only explanation. Instead, she presented 18 months of enforcement data. Similar parties hosted by other families had been handled through ordinary noise reminders, parking notices, or no action at all. Only our family had been subjected to pre-event surveillance, an emergency call, address-specific restrictions, and a fabricated public safety record. The legal issue was no longer a disagreement over neighborhood rules. It was potential selective enforcement, improper use of HOA authority, reputational harm, and a documented emergency report contradicted by objective evidence. The board scheduled a special meeting after its attorney warned that defending Elaine's actions could expose every homeowner to higher insurance costs and legal fees. Elaine arrived wearing the same red blazer, carrying a thick folder, and insisting she had acted to protect the community. But the folder no longer gave her control. The audit log, the penalty draft, the 911 timestamp, and the videos all came from independent systems. None depended on my rank, my memory, or my interpretation. For the first time since the patrol cars appeared outside my house, Elaine was not arguing against me. She was arguing against her own record. The special HOA meeting began under rules set by outside counsel. Elaine was not allowed to control the agenda, select the documents, or interrupt the presentation. The association's attorney opened by explaining that the purpose of the meeting was not to decide whether our barbecue had been tasteful, noisy, or popular. It was to determine whether the HOA president had used emergency services and association authority in a manner unsupported by the evidence. The 911 recording played first. Elaine's voice filled the clubhouse as she described intoxicated teenagers, threats in the street, and a possible weapon. The attorney then displayed the synchronized timestamps from our cameras. At the moment she made those claims, the sidewalk was empty, the beverage coolers were unopened, and the only people visible were catering workers and my brother setting up tables. Next came the penalty draft. Residents saw that it had been created before the police response it cited as justification. The audit log followed, showing that Elaine changed the internal incident report after officers had already found no disturbance. She tried to frame those changes as routine corrections made during a stressful situation. The insurance investigator answered with the system history, the original wording, and the exact account used to make the edits. The association's attorney then confirmed that no board vote had authorized the $500 fine, targeted surveillance, or special restrictions against our address. The neighboring police agency presented only its administrative findings. The responding officers had followed procedure, found no criminal conduct, and preserved the scene accurately. The agency did not announce an immediate criminal charge against Elaine because intent required a separate review. That restraint mattered. It showed that no one was using my position to manufacture a quick punishment. I sat beside Danielle in the back row, wearing an ordinary gray jacket. I did not speak until the board invited a statement. I explained that I had stepped away from every police decision because I wanted the evidence judged without my badge. What happened to my family was serious, not because officers recognized me, but because the same false report could have placed any family in danger before they had a chance to explain. The room became quiet when Thomas Avery read Elaine's email about establishing a record against us before the party. Several residents who had defended her as overly cautious began reviewing the documents again. The issue was no longer whether she had made a bad judgment call. The records suggested planning, unequal enforcement, and an effort to reshape the facts after the event. Outside counsel recommended that the board immediately cancel every violation against our home, suspend Elaine's authority, notify the insurer of a potential civil claim, and commission an independent review of prior enforcement decisions. The motion passed without Elaine's vote. For weeks, she had relied on her title, her red blazer, and the assumption that the first person to report danger would control the story. By the end of the meeting, she no longer controlled the folder in front of her, the board beside her, or the record she had tried to create. Within 2 weeks, every violation against our home was formally withdrawn. The HOA reimbursed our documented legal expenses, issued a written apology to our family, and agreed to independent review of future enforcement complaints. Its insurance carrier required new procedures for emergency reporting, board-approved penalties, and any request involving private security. Elaine was removed as HOA president in a special election. The board did not pretend that one vote could erase what had happened, but it made her authority end where the evidence began. The review of her 911 call continued through the appropriate process, separate from me and separate from the HOA dispute. I never asked for an arrest, a favor, or a public spectacle. A month later, we held another barbecue for Nia. This time, neighbors filled the yard before the grill was hot. Some came to apologize. Others came because they finally understood how easily a false emergency narrative could turn an ordinary family gathering into something dangerous. I had spent most of my career believing that a badge created responsibility. That summer reminded me that evidence creates accountability. Elaine had spoken first, spoken loudly, and trusted her title to protect her. We won because we preserved timestamps, saved every notice, followed the proper process, and refused to let anger replace proof. If you believe property rules, neighborhood authority, or emergency services should never be used to target a family unfairly, share your thoughts in the comments. Save this story, send it to someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories about ordinary people protecting their rights with patience, records, and the truth.